Hey, good morning, everybody. It's good to be back. When Pastor Paul says that there is ongoing ministry from La Jolla Press, we always include ourselves in that. And if you do not know, our church exists, of course, because God is good, and He has a heart for those, especially those who might be marginalized or demonized. But we also exist in part because we have partners like La Jolla Press who have come around us. You have shared your pastor, and you've allowed us to build something in Linda Vista. And we step into a series that Pastor Paul started last week. And it starts with this prayer where Pastor Paul says, you know, we thank God for you because your love for the saints. He starts his letter by saying, we always thank God for you. And the first thing that pops into his mind when he prays for these people is their love for the saints. And when we think of our friends at La Jolla Press, like how can we not? Like the way that you love both near and far. And so always we bring greetings. Our church will be starting in about an hour. So they say hello and they send their love as well.
Yes, absolutely. We bring you greetings from the Church of Linda Vista to the Church of La Jolla. We bring you greetings from a community of former drug addicts who had lost hope until the message of Jesus began to be preached in the very corner that some of them sold or bought their drugs. We bring you greetings from a community of people that is interestingly beginning to draw in children from the neighborhood that come to the church whose parents are not at the church, one of whom insisted to get baptized at 10 years old, and we had to make a phone call home and say, do you know what your daughter is saying? We bring you greetings from that community. We bring you greetings from a community of people that have committed to refuse to dream dreams that don't include the poor, to refuse to do church that doesn't open doors for people that are marginalized and pushed out. We bring you greetings from that community. We bring you greetings from the community that your generosity has helped plant. And because of that, we will never, ever stop giving thanks to God for you. And so as you're listening to the Apostle Paul this morning share from the sincerity of his heart with the people of Colossae, writing this love letter to them, the letter of exhortation and encouragement to them, we also want you to know that in a way we are a love letter from the people of Linda Vista to encourage you towards the faith that we all have professed together.
Yeah, well said. We're going to be in the book of Colossians, chapter 1. And if you're familiar with Colossians, it's right after the book of Philippians. And just to mess with our friends in the back, I wanted to start with chapter 4, verse 18. And it won't be included. But what it says is this, because I think it's important to keep this always in the front of our mind when we read through this letter to the church of Colossae. And in chapter 4, verse 18, the Apostle Paul ends his letter by saying, remember my chains. Remember my chains. When the Apostle Paul wrote this letter, you know, he wasn't sitting in some villa sipping a cocktail, right? He writes this letter imprisoned, and that changes things. You think of a man imprisoned, usually, or the temptation or the danger in that is that God becomes really small and his captors can become really big. If you've had freedom taken away from you, if you've had things taken away from you, if you've suffered great loss, if you've felt chained up, it can feel sometimes that God is really small, too small, in fact, to help you in your predicament. Or maybe he's too big or too aloof to care about your predicament. Right? So it's important for us to know jumping into this passage, that the Apostle Paul is chained up. And even in his chains, he directs our gaze and our worship not to a really small Jesus, but to a really big Jesus. And so he answers a question that we find all throughout the Gospels, right? You remember, Pastor, there's this scene where Jesus is with his disciples in a boat. And he tells them, get in, and we're going to the other side. And they get in, and they're hanging out. Jesus disappears because he's taking a nap. And as he's taking a nap, there's this storm which shakes these disciples who are used to the water. They're being tossed all over the place, and they look around, and they find Jesus sleeping. And they wake him up, and they say, Master, don't you care if we drown? And he stands up, and he just says, shh. And it says, the wind and the waves obeyed and quieted. And you know what their question was? Who is this guy? Who is this? Later on, there's this scene where they think Peter's mother-in-law's house. And they're gathered, and Jesus is teaching, and it was so packed that these 4 people who were carrying their friend who was paralyzed, by the time they got to the door, they couldn't make any sort of headway because it was so packed. You remember what they did? They went around to the side, and they started digging through a roof, and Pastor Paul, we brought some, I'm just kidding. They started digging through, and they lowered their friend right in front of Jesus. And Jesus interrupts his teaching, and he says, I forgive you of your sins. Which was a complete, what nobody expected that meant. And it says Jesus knew what they were thinking and said, what's easier, forgive sins or to tell him to pick up his mat and walk? He does both. And it's the same question. The rest of the crowd was left wondering, who is this man? And in a lot of ways, Pastor Paul, to this brand new church at Colossae, you might have heard some things about Jesus, right? You've been taught well, but perhaps I can give you a seminary level discourse in just a few paragraphs. And we'll pick it up in verse 15. This is Paul's answer to who is this Jesus. He says, the Son, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and by which I, Paul, have become a servant.
He is the image of the invisible God. He is the image. You are made in the image of God, but this one is not made in the... He is the image of the invisible God. Oh, Jesus, please show us the Father. Well, when you have seen me, you have seen the Father. See, I and the Father are one. Like, he is, you can go back into the scriptures, you can go back to Genesis at the beginning of time, and you can take everything that Moses gave you about God, and you can take this man and you can place him right in the middle of all of that. This revelation checks out. He is the image of the invisible God. You are sitting today in a place that is as confusing as Colossae would have been. Colossae, this place that had Greek thought, and so lots of thoughts about God. Colossae, this place that had a Jewish population. And so if you bring up ideas about a Jewish God, why wouldn't you just join them? Colossae, this place that already has a God in Caesar. And in the midst of all of that, Pastor Paul says, this one, is not a philosophy. This one is not a thought that you get to add to your other thoughts. This one is not an idea that you build your life and then you add one more thing to it. It's not. He is the image of the invisible God, Pastor. Oh, the firstborn among all creation. And when you hear firstborn, don't start to think about created things. Don't think about created things. He is the uncreated one. And all of scriptures will point you in that direction. Do you know the message you carry? Do you know the reason why God has sustained you since 1905? Because you carry this message to the world. That in the midst of all the confusion in our world, He is the image of the invisible God.
The Apostle Paul was combating two really dangerous schools of thought. Right? There was this thought driven by Gnosticism that was creeping its way into the culture, which said Jesus is good, and so are all the other gods. He's just one of a lot of deities that you can keep in your little deity pocket, and whenever you need one of them, He's included. And the other school of thought you alluded to, Pastor, was this Jewish influence, which said there's Judaism, go through all the rites, all the traditions that we have as Jews, and then we're going to add Jesus to that. That's kind of like a little cherry on top. And that's when Paul comes back around and corrects both and confronts both. And he says, Jesus is not second place. He does not share. Jesus is not just one out of many. He is the one. He's not just a little deity. He is the deity, right? And in so doing, he forces us into this place of reckoning. Because if Paul begins, and Pastor Paul, we said this passage is way easier to teach than to preach, right? Because you can nerd out on all these little explanations of who Jesus is. We could be here for the next 4 weeks.
And maybe
right?
we should.
Maybe we could.
Just to prove our faith. Open the doors.
Yeah. We just DoorDash.
Yeah.
We have everything we need. Right? So there's these little details that he leaves in that we're going to say, do your homework and dig into those little nuggets that Paul leaves along the way. We wanted to say, Paul makes us reckon with the beauty and the wonder and the bigness of how glorious Jesus is. There is none other. And when he says Jesus is the image, not an image, or not created in an image of, he says he is the image, he is God. He says, now that you and I are confronted with that reality, who do you bend your knee to? Who do you worship? Who do you listen? Who do you allow to influence? Where is your money going? How are you spending your time? What do you think about when you see, he says, listen, you can't not do anything. There's no neutral when it comes to having faith in who Jesus is.
So now, brothers and sisters, we find ourselves at the question that Jesus asked his disciples, right? They are saying, thou art Elijah. They may be saying, thou art Jeremiah. They may be saying, but the question that I want to ask you this morning, same question that Jesus asked his disciples, who in this world of confusion, who do you say your God is? Who do you say Jesus is? This is it. This is it. It's not we'll take this and we'll add this and we'll add this and therefore we're going to add this a little bit on top. And if we're going to be honest with ourselves, if we're going to be honest, all of us live like atheists in some areas of our lives. All of us live as if he is not the image of the invisible God in some areas of our lives. So the journey then becomes, may we reckon with this so we can begin to move from unbelief to belief in every area of our lives. Paul continues by saying this, for in him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Wait. You're telling me that what we see right now isn't all there is? You're telling me that there is an invisible reality among... Yes. There's a visible world functioning now, and I emphasize this because whether you know this or not, and maybe you'll find out if you take a trip to Belize, you take a trip to Malawi, you're gonna see that people speak as if a spiritual reality just exists. The American mind is primarily a scientific mind. It's about everything you can see, feel, and touch. Primarily, so sometimes it's a little difficult to say, there is an invisible reality that exists. The church that the pastors described for us in Linda Vista will not exist if we didn't have a sense of the fact that there is an invisible reality existing. Just this past Easter, we both baptized our daughters, right? 10-year-olds, kids. We were baptizing them in the same water where we baptized Eric, who was on meth for 45 years. Who says, his words, I was a rock star. I was a rock star playing for all these amazing bands, and then drugs caused me to spiral, and I ended up homeless, sleeping at every single dump you can think about, every single dumpster you can think about in this neighborhood. And one day, this Jesus said, it's time, son. It's time. And so this last Sunday, or 2 Sundays ago, he became among the 9 people that we baptized, professing a faith in Christ. In what waters do you baptize 10-year-olds, our daughters, and Eric together? Unless if around all the things that we do in the physical, unless God was also working in the invisible space. There are things you cannot see. There are things you cannot see. In your home, in your families, there are things that are taking place that you cannot see. But even in that, Christ is God. He is.
Yeah, that triggered something. When I got home last summer from Malawi, I got home to a phone call, and it was from a friend of Vicky. Vicky's one of ours. She's houseless. And Vicky's friend said, "Hey, Pastor, you have to come now. Vicky's son has been shot." And by the time I got there, they had covered the body, but you could still see the feet. And we were standing on the corner. If you look at any of our baptism videos, we were standing on the same corner. And I had Vicky, and we wept for, again, violence taking away one of our sons. Right? And 2 weeks ago, Vicky got baptized in that very spot. So don't tell me that Jesus is any sort of small. And that he's not in this process of going in and grabbing his sons and daughters out of this darkness and bringing them into the marvelous light, as Peter talks about. And Paul brings it home, and he says right here in verse 21, he says, "And you." Hey, by the way, I'm in jail. I haven't lost my faith. Jesus is still just as big as he ever was, because they can take everything away from me, but he is still on the throne. And one of the ways that I know that is he says, "You and I and all of you, you were alienated from God." It has to be bad before it gets good, right? There's not this, Jesus is amazing. He's the firstborn. He is in all, and everything is for, and he's just so lucky to have you on his team. That's not what Paul says. He says, Jesus changes directions. Let's talk about you. Let's talk about Jeremiah. Alienated from God. Alienated. That's not, I took a wrong turn and ended up lost. Alienation speaks to an intentionality. It speaks to a separation. And not just that, he says, you who were once alienated and hostile in mind. Oh, because he knows how we get these little inner lawyers working on our behalf, right? Like, I know, but Pastor, at least I didn't rob a bank, and the government doesn't count, right? No, he says that's a joke. There's this hostility. Yeah, it didn't go over well. There's this hostility, not necessarily in what you do, but in how you think. And that brings a level playing ground to the foot of the cross. It's not just going out and committing an atrocious crime. Paul is saying you were alienated and you participated in evil deeds through the hostility of your thoughts. The things that you thought that were harmful to other people, created in the image of God. The things that you did not do, that you justified because of any sort of thing. He's saying you were alienated. You were, some translations it says, you were God's enemy. He makes it really clear that the reason why we're in this family is not because of how great we are, but because of how great Jesus is. Now, listen to this. That's what makes this part so sweet. You who were once alienated, hostile, doing evil deeds, verse 22, he has now, present tense, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death. That's the cost. If you start thinking about how great you are and how lucky he is to have you on his team, you cheapen the death part. Right? Yes. We're all in some ways in that spectrum between the 10-year-old girl and Eric, but we're still in need of the waters. And it's Jesus who says, I'm going to bring you into my body. Earlier he says that includes the church, that includes this heir, that includes the wider family that you're adopted into, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. So, Pastor, we were saying last night, what a movement from alienation to reconciliation to presentation.
Yes.
How's that for 3 points? Hey! And I didn't even go to Princeton. Yeah. From alienation to reconciliation to presentation. And all three of those things are big.
So you're presented blameless. You are free. You're free. What are you going to do with the freedom that has been given to you, that you have not earned? You're free. You stand not accused. You were an enemy of God. You stand not accused. You're free. What are you going to do? This is it. That's the difference. We are not living our lives because we are afraid of what the gods might do, which would have been a school of thought in Colossae, right? Because you see, remember in these early days, it's a part of the reason why you want to satisfy the gods is that if you don't, really crazy things may happen. In fact, in the early days of the Christian faith, really crazy things did happen, and people would pick on the Christians and say it's because of them. Right? It's because of them, because now they are not worshiping this God and that God and that God. So those gods are not satisfied. And so if the natural disaster has taken place, who can we throw out of the boat into the water? But it's not as if we have to satisfy the gods to live this out. It's that you are free. You have been given the freedom by the God. Listen to this. I'm gonna work backwards just a little bit. He is this God before all things. And in him all things hold together. My goodness. In American culture, the calendar holds all things together. In American culture, the agenda holds all things together. You have the calendar, you have the agenda, and you don't sleep. And Paul is saying, go to bed. Because in him, all things hold together. The things that are troubling you, hold together in him. The things that you can think about right now, hold together in him. And in fact, the things that you can't even fathom, the things that you don't even have the capacity, the brain power to think about, these things hold together in him, in Christ. You are free. And by the way, and he is the head of the body, the church. We're not, right? It's hard sometimes to leave our young little congregation to not be there on a Sunday. I have to be reminded. It was really hard when we were discussing the fact that we won't be back today. And I kept saying, no, but we can preach at 10. And right after, it's like in the angst is about wanting to hold things together. Oh, he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead. What is Paul even talking about? Even death and the dead, even death, the thing that scares you, he says, no, he's over that too. Your greatest concern If you were afraid of anything and death walked in here, you might actually be afraid of death. The greatest, he says, he's firstborn from among the dead, by the way. He's conquered that too. And so that in everything he might have supremacy. He's got veto power. He's got veto power. Like the supreme judge can make a decision and he can veto it. Right? Like your husband can make a decision and he can veto it. Like, it was always funny when I first started working with missionaries from America before I moved to the States when I was in Malawi. Because the strange thing among the missionaries was in my young observation, all African women are scared of their husbands, and all American missionary men were scared of their wives. I'm like, they're freaked out. We were telling one of our friends, our coach, we were like, a whole team of soccer players, like, hey, there's a big game, it's a Champions League game. You are the only one with television at your house for this missionary. Can we come and watch the game at your house? And I never will forget this, because now it's like, no, duh, he did the right thing. But back then I was like, he's like, oh yeah, that's a great game. Yes, you guys may be able to come. Let me talk to my wife first. And all of us look at each other like, it was funny at the time. Like, wait, what? You can't just say we'll come. But that's the thing. Over that, he's got veto power over anybody that you're concerned about. He's in him. There's supremacy in him. Right? He runs everything. Don't take on a philosophy just to take. He runs everything. Paul keeps saying, in how many things? All things. All things. All things. Right? He runs everything. And this God has granted you freedom. Freedom. He says, you are free. Right? If it was me at this point, I would just leave the organ. I'm going home. I'm free. I'm free. That's how I'm going to use my freedom. I'm not playing the organ anymore. I'm free. No, I'm sure she plays the organ from the overflow of our freedom. But this is it. From the overflow of our freedom, we have joy to go live out our lives as if to say to other people, He is the image of the invisible God. Stand over your fence today to your neighbor. He is the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn among all creation. And oh, by the way, I'm free and you can be too. How are you going to use your freedom that comes out of this beautiful reconciliation He is?
One last encouragement, so we're out of time. We'll get out of your way. If, it says in verse 23, if you continue in the faith, strong, steadfast, holding on to this hope that you've been given. And would that be our prayer for you? As young men who need mentors, as a young church who need spiritual heroes, may you live out and understand the reality that's contained in this passage of the beauty and the magnificence and the supremacy of Jesus. And in those moments, because Paul knows, like those moments are high and sweet, there are also some dark moments when our faith begins to shake. There might be some in here where Paul would say, for your own sake, for the sake of the gospel, one more foot. Just continue to walk in the faith that you've been given. Yes. Strong. Don't begin to lose hope now. Don't lose hope now. We're almost there. And as doubts creep in, or as earthquake, it was an earthquake area, as earthquakes shake your foundation, as these schools of thought begin to creep, as you begin to question, don't lose hope now. You who were once alienated have now been brought back home. And you are being presented as pure and holy. That's priestly language. Into the presence and the service of our King. Let's pray. God, what a passage. Forgive us for not, like Paul, just so often being caught in awe and wonder of how beautiful and majestic you are. And God, words fall short. And as we sit in your presence, we understand that this same Jesus that Paul described here in this passage, who is preeminent and worthy of our worship, also died in order to bring us, to reconcile us into your family. And for those two things, God, we sing. For those two things, God, we desire to love our neighbors. For those two things, God, we desire to grow and continue in our faith. And it's in your name that we pray.